Hey, my name is Tawanda Clark Edgar. If you didn't catch that in the very beginning, I will be the moderator for today's session, the Fireside Chat. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Gwen's Girls. And what we're going to be looking at today is a hot topic, the why behind the behavior. And this is something that I hold near and dear to my heart. We have Dr. Brian Sims from the Joma House, and we have Dr. Venus Evans Winters, who will be here with us to support the conversation that we will be having. We'll encourage you to put your questions in the chat as you're coming in and as we are starting to move along. I ask you to put your feeling word, your one feeling word in the chat, because if you didn't know, we here at Gwen's Girls are a sanctuary model. So everything we do it through a trauma-informed lens. The meetings that we hold, the work that we do with our girls, we always start with what we call the community meeting. And the community meeting is based on 3 questions that we ask. And we start every meeting off with, how are you feeling? No words like good or bad, because we know that those are buffer words. People use those. And that really doesn't give an accurate representation of how people are. And as I said, we are a sanctuary model. So everything that we do it through the lens of a trauma responsive approach. So there are 3 questions. How are you feeling? What are your goals for today? And should you need help, who can you ask? We always start everything off with that. And then we have a platform that in the event that our girls or our staff needs additional support, they can always ask for a check-in. That gives us a way to gauge how we're feeling and what's going on. And so sanctuary is not just theory for us, it's practice. It's actually the way that we deliver our programming. And our girls seem to really enjoy that. That makes them feel that they are present and they are a part of who we are. So I want to go ahead and get started. I see that we do have Dr. Venus Evans Winters, activist, author and speaker with us today, and also a collaborator here at Gwen's Girls. We are always happy to have her in the place with us. So Dr. Venus, why don't you a bit more about who you are and your organization and some of the great things that you do?
Thank you very much, Twanda. It's so good to be back here. I'm very familiar with the sanctuary model, so I am feeling excited and affirmed. I'm back in community with some of my favorite people. So my name is Dr. Venus Evans Winters. I also go by Dr. V. I am the executive director and founder of Planet Venus Institute. I'm also a research and policy scholar with the African American Policy Forum as their Black Girls Research Initiatives coordinator. I'm also a psychotherapist in private practice, as well as a clinical complex trauma professional. And so, and as you know, I also do a lot of work with Black girls and Black women around their psychosocial and psycho-spiritual development.
So I'm certainly happy that I've had the opportunity to sit under you and to learn. You really have helped us a lot here at Gwen's Girls. Your work definitely explores historical and generational traumas that are experienced by Black women. And that was certainly helpful to us here to get in touch with some of the things that you were teaching us. And we know it's important, but can you tell our group that's meeting with us today why it's important to map out trauma generationally?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, Twanda. And so I think now more people are becoming familiar with the ideas around trauma. And I think especially in the Black and Indigenous communities and other communities of color, we're learning a lot more about generational trauma or transgenerational trauma. Now, what a lot of people in the public don't know, because you're used to talking about trauma as an interpersonal thing. So maybe we witnessed a horrific event. Maybe we actually survived a horrific or traumatizing event. Or maybe if we didn't witness it or experience a traumatic event, maybe someone told us about an event. Or imagine now with social media, we may see things like the killing of Breonna Taylor or the killing of George Floyd, right before our eyes, and we see it over and over again. So when we're thinking about transgenerational trauma, what our community here should know is that now we're getting into some more complex ideas. So now we're thinking about your mama's trauma. We're thinking about grandma's trauma. We're thinking about our dads and grandparents' trauma. Now, a lot of the genetic stuff we're thinking about mostly from the maternal side of it, but also our paternal genes are passed on to us. So we think about the embodiment of trauma and how trauma can be encoded on our bodies. That's one aspect, that's the genetic. But what happens if your mom or your dad or your other caregivers have also, that could be your aunts, that could be your, your older cousins, or teachers, they're passing on their own traumatic experiences and how they cope with trauma, and that can be negative or positive, onto you. And so that's what we mean by transgenerational trauma, or that's what we're talking about. We're talking about generational trauma. And then, of course, for Africans in America, we also have to grapple with the realities of historical trauma. So that can come through the curriculum when we're talking about the enslavement of African people, or of course, in the media, we might experience the history of violence against women, especially women of color. And so that's what we're talking about with historical and generational trauma. And it's important to discuss because we don't just want to go in and mitigate or prevent, say, interpersonal trauma. That's one-on-one. But now we're talking about societal impact, and we have to go back in time. So I'll stop there for now. That was a quick lesson on historical and transgenerational trauma.
It was. And so you said a lot there, Dr. V, and I want people to know if they want more, we'll talk about how they can get additional information from you as we are moving on. Before we close out, I'll make sure that they have that in the chat. And also we'll talk about how they can get some of your books too, because I think it's really important for people to understand that. So when we think about everything that you just told us about this generational trauma and it being passed down from our grandparents and our parents, what do you think is the best way to engage Black women when it comes to mental health, PTSD, and that generational trauma? Because we don't want to talk to everybody. So
yeah, that was a good one. Tawana, thank you. And so sometimes we do have to have these conversations privately or in community, because you're right, they're so personal to not only our families or familial life experiences, but also the community and who we are personally, right? Our own journeys. And so I do think it's important to talk to Black girls and Black women about trauma. And when I say talk to them, define it. Just like you started off the conversation with, how are we defining trauma? How are we defining generational trauma? We can also talk about chronic stress, right? So I do believe we need to have those conversations. And that's why the model that I use is a pedagogical approach where we teach Black girls and young Black women and femmes basically how to educate themselves about trauma and chronic stress or toxic stress so that they can help heal other girls while participating in their own healing process. So it's the Sankofa methodology. So reaching back in order to learn how to move forward. And then while we're imagining our futures, how to survive and cope with the present in order to transform our social condition. So the way that I think about it from a teaching perspective, or working with youth and indigenous communities, Black communities, is that we define it. Then next, what we do is we do talk about the historical so that that girl won't think this is only my problem. I am a survivor of incest or rape or molestation or teacher abuse or police abuse because I did something wrong. This is a societal, and it goes back at least 400 years in the United States. So that's the historical, very important. Have a historical component to your pedagogy when teaching trauma. Second, we have to teach our girls, how did other women, Black women, African women, what did we do not only to survive, but what have we done in order to thrive? That's how you foster resilience. That's how you foster resilience. Let me tell everybody here, Kelly, Amy, Mary, we never tell girls, you've been traumatized. You're experiencing racism. You're experiencing sexism, without giving them the tools of how to fight against these inequalities and oppressions. You have to. So that's next. We give a history lesson, not just history, contemporary. How is Stacey Abrams fighting back? Right? How is Tawanda fighting back? How is Tashira fighting back? How is Miss Kathy fighting back? So we have to show them real life examples in the past as well as in the present. And next, this is really important because sometimes we don't see our girls, any of our children as brilliant, but kids are actually very brilliant. They're very smart. They're still going to make mistakes because their brains are still developing. And people who haven't had a lot of experiences should be making mistakes. That's actually how the brain develops. That's how the spirit grows as well, right? And so third part of this, give them the theories. Tell them the why. That's a part of our conversation today, the why behind the behavior. So why not also tell them the why and the how to resist, and also our models. How are we thinking about trauma? How are we thinking about healing? How are we thinking about resistance and recovery and restoration? And so pedagogically, again, what are we teaching? The history, the how to resist, as well as the basic concepts, and give them the theories and the methodologies of what trauma is and what trauma ain't.
Absolutely. You know, Dr. V, I'd love hearing you talk. One of the things that I want to highlight that you said, though, when you were speaking, is you talked about this idea of that thriver-led model. So hearing from other people who have gone through, perhaps what some of our girls have gone through and how they have gotten through it. And you talked about that resiliency piece and always approaching it from a strength-based perspective, that we don't tell our girls that they've been traumatized. I think that is very powerful. And so you talked about that being one of the barriers. So I want to ask you, what other barriers do you see that Black women and girls face in healing, particularly trauma, but racial trauma as well?
That's a really good question. And so it's interesting because we very rarely in the trauma field as a clinical. So my designations, for people who are wondering, because I love when we have young people and college students because they want to know more about this, or even young adults who are interested in going back to school. So I am a clinical trauma professional, that's CTP, and I'm also a complex clinical trauma professional, that's CCTP. Okay. And so that's a very small designated field, right? So I have to deal with the biology, physiology of the body, the mind, and the brain. And I also have to deal with like crisis responses, right? And so when you talk, so racial trauma is hardly coming up. I mean, to be honest, it's a male dominated field. If I walk into a room to do training, I'm probably facing a lot of white male psychiatrists, to be honest. And so when you think, we're still theorizing this thing called racial trauma, we know what it is. We don't know what it ain't. And everyday parlance is the enslavement of a group of human beings. And everyday speech is being able to have access to a woman's or a girl's body whenever you want to. Okay, racial trauma is George Floyd. Racial trauma is Breonna Taylor. Racial trauma is Sandra Bland. Racial trauma is every time we, open up our social media, we see some Black girl or woman being harassed, by a man for whatever reason, and usually at the hands of someone of a different racial group. And so with that said, we are just now beginning to have conversations openly, publicly about racial trauma. We've always had them. You can go back to Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells documented this thing called racial trauma, right? Carter G. Woodson said, we're going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem because we keep putting our kids in front of we're going to be forced to put our kids in front of white teachers and professors, and at what cost? So racial trauma is very dynamic, but the best way to imagine it is if you keep putting in front of people violent episodes, violent behaviors, violent ways of thinking about a group of people, or responding or interacting with a group of people. It can even be policies. And the whole goal is to subjugate them, to oppress them, to cause physical or psychological harm. And again, that can be generational, or it can be contemporary forms of violence and harm. And so what makes it difficult, Twanda, and everybody here, this is going to be our takeaway for today. What makes it difficult to heal from racial trauma for Black girls and Black women is the simple fact that we keep getting hit over and over and over and over again. If you all remember, when we just heard the verdict regarding Breonna Taylor, it wasn't even 2 or 3 days later when Ma'Khia Bryant, pop, 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 heard that once again when that police officer jumped out the car and shot her. We weren't present. But how can we heal from our own trauma when we're still having to deal with on the daily race-based trauma? So that's the most difficult aspects. That's the why. When we're working with Black girls, why is it so hard for us to heal our communities and ourselves? Is because we don't have recovery time. I can take somebody out of Afghanistan. I can take a patient out of Iraq, right? I can take them out of a war zone. I can take them out of a national disaster environment. I can't take an entire group of people out of white supremacy, at least not overnight.
So, Dr. V, I'm going to ask you, how do we create those healing spaces in our communities, in our homes, in our workplace? Can you give us a couple of suggestions on how we can start to counter that on some level?
Yeah, so a thoughtful question. If anybody's taking notes and if you have journals, I'm going to give you 3 practical tips. And Twanda, you know this because I know about your program, and hopefully we'll have a lot of opportunity to hear not just about the sanctuary model, but the work that you're doing with girls. We have to have ritual work. All the data is coming in, right, Brian? Right? Anybody who's dealing with healing and things like that, there's more work coming in. So when you look at Indigenous community, humankind, that's a risk of being human. You're going to have accidents. You're going to have mistakes. People are going to hurt your feelings. You're going to probably experience some form of violence, trauma, because trauma could be even medical, right? It could be a car accident, etc. It can be the loss of a family member, right? But when you're talking about trauma, how we heal that, something that may be encoded in our DNA, or something that, again, we have very little control over it, especially as vulnerable, people in the US or in the world in some cases. We have to go back to rituals, because the research is showing how Indigenous people survive was through rituals, being in community with the same people, for long periods of time, being intentional in our gatherings and doing something that our minds and bodies know is coming. I know that I'm going to meet with Twanda once a month, or I know that I'm going to see my mentor, my Muse, every Wednesday on the 30th. And I know we're going to dance, right? I know that we're going to journal. I know that we're going to do art, because another aspect of healing work is, besides community and rituals or knowing what's going to happen next, because we need consistency to heal, we also need to move the body. I love when I'm working with adult women too. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, yeah, Dr. V, I've been with you for a whole 6 weeks. Now what? I'm like, okay, when did you move your body? Like, did you dance today? Did you take a long walk? Yeah. And so, yeah, so you have to think about the body, and it's simple. It can be breath work. It can be meditation. I'm a hypnotherapist. I love it. Like, I could hypnotize people who have experienced severe chronic stress and trauma, right? Or just people who need it for relaxation purposes, or to lose weight or stop smoking or whatever, right? It's up to them. But you have to engage in something with the body. Right? And third piece of advice and that could be journaling too, I should say that. So you might be like, girl, I can't dance. I get it. The older I get, I'm kind of losing my moves too. And my kids don't want to see all of that. They don't like my twerk game. But if you can't move with yoga or dance classes on YouTube, you can also, or walk outside for safety reasons. That could be issues for some people. Thirdly, also, if you don't have access to a clinician or therapist, you have to talk. You have to get it out. We're trying to reprocess all that negative, bad hormones through the body work, through self-reflection, and have like a spiritual practice. Some people's spiritual practice might be more vocal. It can be singing. It might be, I think I'm a rapper. I'm hoping one day I'll call me up and ask me for something. It can be meditation. It can be prayer. But all of these things we know for sure are documented ways to heal. And also, of course, continue to learn. Yes, Shira, my mixtape. Continue to learn. Believe it or not, learning and cognitive development, or learning a new skill and reading new information, actually helps us heal from trauma. It creates new pathways. Yes. So therefore, making up for the pathways that have been harmed, so to speak. Okay, so any of you
That's
can
great.
do after school programs, before school programs, weekend programs, or read with your child, or teach a new skill, you learn a new skill with yourself. It can be sewing, it can be knitting. Yeah, so all three of those things, or three and a half, right? Because learning can be a part of that vocalizing it. Yeah.
All right.
So, yep, that's the how when we move beyond the why.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just reiterate, I think those are three very important things that you said. So you said rituals. We have to create those space of rituals, whether it be through journaling, that we set up expectations for our young people, that they know that there's going to be a ritual. So sanctuary is one of the rituals that we have with community meeting. And then you talked about moving the body. That is so important because you feel better when you move your body. And that's key. And so we want to remember to do that, learning more. And did I miss one, Dr. V? I want you to repeat that.
Yeah, so rituals, right? Moving the body and learning, or
And
even just
learning.
processing at times to speak or to be vocal about it. Yep.
Okay. All right. And Tashara put them in the chat. So rituals, move the body, and learning
There
are the
you go.
three things that we can do to create a safe space where we're at. So I want to pause, Dr. V, for a minute. I'm going to come back to you, but I want to go to some of the videos of our girls, and I want to hear what they have to say when we talk about the why behind the behavior. And then I'm going to go to Dr. Smith, and I'm going to come back to you, Dr. V, because I want to talk about your book and all of the great things that you have going on and all of the work that you're doing. So can we play the footage, please? Okay, so the sound, we can't hear it. All right, and while we are actually working through the sound, we always ask our girls to work through, and be a part of anything that we're doing. And so we ask them the question about, what do adults need to know about discipline? And, we ask them to talk about the why behind the behavior from their perspective. So while I think we might have it up now, and if it's up, we'll keep going with that. But in a few seconds, I'm actually going to go to Dr. Smith from Joma Works, and I'm going to ask him after the video to tell us about his program and what they do, and really to talk about the need for culturally responsive mental health programming. Are we ready? Is the video working? Okay, so tell me, what's one thing you would want adults to know about the best way to discipline?
A lot like with what Naima said, like you should never like start out yelling at a child or a kid or anything. You should always like be like nurturing and comforting, because like in like all in your delivery, like it could really like take the situation that's already at 10, you could take it to 100, or you can de-escalate it and be like, hey, what's wrong? What's going on? And just like the tone of your voice can make the person just like, I'm not having a good day, instead of like yelling at them or like just immediately like saying like you're suspended or you're expelled or anything. Like you just like completely below the situation at proportion. So taking that like therapeutic, that calm, nurturing approach to like any situation that you're having with a student can really make it all the more better.
I would say to take a therapeutic approach before you sit here and try to scream in somebody's face, because you have to understand where that person's coming from and why they feel that way or why they're expressing certain emotions.
So the why behind the behavior, understanding why they are expressing certain emotions and why they feel the way they feel.
I think that adults tend to forget that we are also people. Forget an age or a title, a mom, a daughter. We are still people. We still have feelings. How would you feel if that was said to you, or if said to you like that? It's not, I know there's chains of command and, our parents are superior to us, but I still have that same amount of feelings as you do. And I just wish, or even teachers, like they should take that into consideration, where that we are people, just like you.
Like patience is really important, because a lot of times adults or just people in general will jump to conclusions about things and not really fully understand or grasp what's going on. So just taking the time to listen before your initial reaction, because sometimes when you hear something, like your reaction is going to be like, oh, like a bad reaction. So just take time to listen before you really react, because you might not really know what's fully going on.
Okay, so having a minute to process, and I'd like to say out of the mouth of babes. I love working with teenagers because I feel like they tell you everything you need to know if you're willing to listen to what they have to say. And this really does tie into a lot of what I'm sorry, I like to call her Dr. V, but Dr. Winters has been telling us. But I want to pause for a minute to see if we have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far. And then I want to go into hearing from Dr. Sims from Joma Works and hearing his approach to culturally responsive mental health. So I'm going to check the chat just to see if we have any questions. And if not, we're going to just keep it moving. And I see that we do have a couple of responses. People are saying this is powerful. And we're looking at what Dr. Winters has said about the rituals, the move the body and learning. So Dr. Sims, tell us a little bit about Joma Works, if you would, and this need for culturally responsive mental health services.
Yeah, hey everybody. Thank you so much for making space. Good to see the familiar faces. Dr. V, oh my gosh, how you doing, first of all? Tough act to follow. Whoever had me following Dr. V, I need to have a conversation because just amazing energy and insight, and your work always brings just not only a smile, but the type of tough questions that I think have to be asked and faced if we're really serious about this work. So I'm actually feeling a little bit overwhelmed at the moment. Wanted to your point about like hearing the voices of the young folks. I think I agree with you 100%. Most of what I think we know as adults is echoed and mirrored in the voices and in the lives of the young folks that we work with. So I just really got a lot out of hearing those voices and perspectives. So I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I'm gonna try to muddle through it. Brian Carey Sims, I'm executive director at Joma Works. Joma Works is an education management consulting firm. We specialize in university K-12 partnership development. So basically that's code for pulling resources out of the university, higher education sphere to benefit communities through K-12 schools. So huge shout out to Dr. Elliott and everyone at Gwen's Girls. We've had, fruitful, productive partnership with BGEA for going on almost 3 years now, really. So thank you for inviting us into this space. I do want to talk a little bit about, and I want to answer your questions, Wanda, around our program that looks at school mental health. But if it's okay, I'd love to sort of just reflect on some of the brilliance that Dr. V sort of dropped on us. And I'm very familiar with the sanctuary model. I think it's awesome. I do come from, so one of our values at Joma Works is around dialogue, which for us sort of means not just like one-way transmission of information, but honest and sincere engagement with other folks and their ideas. I'm a big proponent of the reality that to do that, to truly dialogue with each other in community requires courage, because we're not always going to agree. Sometimes you'll see it differently than I see it. Sometimes you won't be able to say what I would say. I think dialogue is the point, right? If I'm saying what you're saying, then there's an old one of my favorite West African proverbs is, where there are two wise men that agree, there's no need for one of them. So it's our differences, it's our differing points of view that add to community and bring out the life, I think, in the work that we're trying to accomplish. So if I could, I would love to reflect on just a couple of the, I think, really critical points that Dr. B sort of centered for us. The conversation around trauma obviously is an important one, and folks whose work is in that lane and that area, I tip my cap, because it's a difficult thing to do. It's difficult to have conversations around pain. It's very difficult to be honest and sincere about oppression and whether it's interpersonal or social or historical, like she brought out, all of that for sure. I wanted, though, to introduce, or not necessarily introduce, but to also center the reality of culture itself as being necessary for the conversation. So do we, as African people of African descent, folks from indigenous communities, do we have to know and understand and always be mindful of trauma and trauma-informed models? Absolutely. But I would argue that to only be informed around the trauma is incomplete, and in actuality may be part of the system that we're actually trying to strive against. And what I mean by that is African people, like indigenous folks from cultural groups, from civilizations, thousands of generations the world over, we have more of a historical legacy than the pain and the difficulty and the obstacles presented by white supremacy. If we start the conversation with trauma, I think what we risk is communicating to our Black girls, to our children, to our future generations, their lineage, their history, their potential that, like Dr. V pointed out, the trauma is encoded in our genes. There's some wonderful, excellent work that's coming out around that. But that's not the only thing that's encoded in our DNA. These children, these babies, the folks that we work with and we want to teach and hold and protect and care for and nurture. Like, it's not those individuals, they're not the products of an American system of values and behaviors. They're the survivors of an American system. Their lineage, their DNA predates America. Their lineage, their DNA predates Europe. So I want that to sink in. I think it's very, very important that if we're going to be serious about the question around what's the why behind the behavior, and we introduce the concept of trauma, let's also introduce the concept of triumph. Like, African people have triumphed for thousands of generations before there was European oppression, and we will triumph again. So I see the hope in working with, Black and brown girls, boys, non-binary, you name it, not so much, not exclusively in the understanding and the analysis of trauma, but also in the expectation and the potential for a revisitation on ancestral models that our children still carry with us today. I lost my father earlier this week. He's got beautiful grandchildren. One of them is my daughter. And as he was transitioning, I give thanks for the opportunity to be able to share with her that as he physically transitions, and Dr. V spoke to this, right? This is the notion of ritual. As he physically transitions, that's not the end of Grandpa. Like, Black folks, people of African descent, indigenous all over the world have always understood this is a spiritual conversation. So the rituals that we do in the physical help us tap into the spiritual, and therein lies, I think, the real sort of, at least for me, the real definition of healing. It's when we're able to return to the true nature and the true essence of who we are. And so I wanted to sort of kind of throw that out there before I talk about the model. I would also like to, something else Dr. V made me think about, and this goes back to her insightful analysis around the trauma. Dr. Amos Wilson, who's an African-centered psychologist, he's got a model where he discussed this concept of psychic violence. And as Dr. V was talking, I was thinking about the need to be honest around what I heard some of the young folks in that video speak about, Twanda. Dr. Wilson's notion of psychic violence was one of the disorienting impact and influence on an individual that seems from the physical eye to be invisible, but that the person kind of just feels or senses all around them, all around them. So Matt, and it's difficult. I think I might be the only guy at this whole call. I feel a little bit outnumbered, but that's okay, I'll muddle through. But it's difficult to imagine the notion for those who haven't, folks who haven't walked in these particular sets of shoes, around taking a look around, and everywhere you see images and notions and values and models and aspirations that do not come from you or your people. At the same time, being met at every turn, literally around every corner, is another reminder of your intellectual, emotional inferiority. Dr. Wilson says that creates this notion of psychic violence that, even if you don't acknowledge it, is going to impact the foundations of who you are as a human. And I think, again, if healing requires honesty, I think we got to be honest about that psychic violence. I don't think that, in a general sense, we from schools, from financial institutions, from healthcare, certainly from law enforcement, from labor, housing, you name it. I don't think we've even really scratched the surface on being able to understand the psychic violence potential that exists for the average Black girl who's leaving her home, but not even leaving her home, in her home, right? We know what the evidence says, like the violence that women, Black girls are subject to, it's not even about leaving the home. It starts in the home in many cases. So wanted to sort of throw those out there, Twanda. I think the question, and could I maybe throw a slide or two up?
You can certainly throw a slide or two up. I think that would be great. I think you covered a lot.
Okay. Am I over time?
No, we're fine. We're fine. Okay. I think that people are taking it in because I don't see that there are any questions in the chat just yet. And while you're finding your slides and you're putting them up, I think that when we're talking about this whole concept around the why behind the behavior, people look at, our girls and our young people, and they see the behavior, but they're not taking, they just want it to stop. But I don't think they ever look at it from a healing centered approach. And so I think you really talked about a lot. So I'm interested in hearing about your slides. So
agreed. Just the visual to give you some sort of like idea of like the mass of people that we're talking about here. So if we just restrict the conversation just to people of African descent, the so-called African Americans, you name it, we're talking about millions of people. So if you got about 13% of folks in the States, of those, about 16% reported having mental illness, and that's just recently. That 16% number is just folks who say, like the last year. That right there is over 7 million people. So if you just sort of close your eyes and imagine every single person in Chicago, Houston, and Philly, that's how many folks we're talking about from a mental health standpoint. You combine that with the reality that today in 2022, this data is actually from 2017, but I've seen data that's just come out. We're basically looking at the same scenario. If we're talking about women and girls in the so-called African-American community, Black and African-American homes, women are the heads of household in about 30% of those homes. Now that's roughly three times greater than in our white counterparts. So I don't really have an answer here, Twanda. I really have a question. And I feel like, again, going back to this notion of these notions of trauma, these notions of psychic violence, the damage and the disruption that exists, like, again, in every corner, aspect, and facet of society, what is a data point like this? What are the implications of this for Black girls, right? Like, this is not like a marginal difference. We're talking about basically if white homes are 9 or 10%, black homes are like 3 times as many in terms of woman-led households. I think we have to begin to understand that the mental health question is not an isolated issue. This is a comprehensive situation that is only really confused if we try to reduce it into one particular area. So our program at JOMA Works looks at school mental health, but mental health is broader than what's happening in schools. Mental health is broader than what's happening in any other sort of like individual aspect of society. Again, we sort of favor models and frameworks and language that get us to appreciate the holistic, comprehensive assault on African femininity. And I just don't think that there's any other way of saying that. When I talk to folks and they would prefer to use language around, equity, diversity, and inclusion as a solution, I sort of scratch my head, because although there's nothing wrong with equity, diversity, or inclusion, I don't see it as solutionary for the problem that exists. What we don't have is a failing or broken system. What we do have is a system that's working perfectly to assault and hurt and undermine Black femininity and Black families at large. And that's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of folks, but it's a conversation that I'm insistent on having, because I don't think that the data tell any other story. Where you see Black and brown folks, you see disparities. Where you see Black girls in any, again, walk of life, the data is almost universally in agreement around this point. Where you see Black girls, you see problems, you see damage, and you see destruction. This, to me, as a sort of common sense, scholar, would not indicate something that's not working right. It would seem to me that something that's working right. And the problem is that we're not able to appreciate the fact that these systems of white supremacy have been built not in our interest. Or as it relates to Black women, not in the interest of Black femininity. So it's with those things in mind that I would offer sort of models of education that do at least in an honest attempt to center the cultural authenticity of Black and brown folks in the mental health model. In other words, mental health is not a one size fits all. If we buy the notion and the value of culture, right, which we celebrate European cultural history like 365 days a year. We have European icons, European superheroes that we all know their names and we sing their songs and we understand their legends. So the notion of culture is not lost on us as a country, as a society. It's the notion of African cultural integrity that's lost on us as an American society. And so to introduce to young Black girls the reality that, again, you have a history, you have a legacy, you have a responsibility, right, as a Black woman, that right there, I think totally changes the game. It shifts the conversation from how do we mitigate and undermine things like racial discrimination, which is an important conversation. It shifts the conversation from what do we do about emotional harm and trauma, when it comes to, problems negotiating social structures. And those are important conversations. But it shifts the conversation from how do you respond, what is the value of resilience, to who are you? And I feel like that's the fundamental question that children are that they have to answer in order to progress from a psychosocial, emotional development standpoint. If they're not able to ask and answer that question successfully, we'll always see the unfortunate sort of implications of society gone wrong. We'll always see, criminal behavior. We'll always see failed homes. That 30% will grow if we as adults are not able to position our children in a way that they can ask and answer the question of who are we. So this is one of our partners down in Jacksonville, Florida, Dr. Kobe Kanban Academy. On the right is its founder and executive director, Temilade Unsheun. She's working to develop this African-centered model in Jacksonville. I just wanted to sort of shamelessly plug it because we're working with them. But there are models like this literally all over the country and all over the world. Models in which the education, the emotional development, the et cetera, is literally fused with positive images and notions of cultural, authenticity. So our model at JOMA works around a culturally responsive school mental health approach really sort of starts from there. It's how do we, as educators, as teachers, as folks, engaging with students in after school models or STEM-based tutorial programs, or you name it, how do we successfully bring that reality to children? How do we explain and communicate to them that where they have problems, they're not problematic? Where they have challenges, they're not, limited in their capacity. I share this with you all. It's a bit of a personal story, but I remember my son, he's 15 now, but I remember when he started public school, I told him, I said, you're going to get in trouble in school. I said, this is not a question of if. I know the data. Black boys in public school run into problems. I said, when you get into some sort of problem at your school, Twanda, and the principal calls me in and says, this is what your son did, I said, I'm going to tell the principal, thank you very much, and you and I are going to go out for ice cream. And he was confused until around third grade, something happened, and I got called in, tears streaming down his face. He was saying, Dad, I didn't, and he lied, and she, and blah, 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 blah. And I said, look, son, I said, I know you, I love you. You're not problematic. It doesn't matter what transpired. I know that you were put in a system that's literally engineered for you to fail. This is a designed outcome for Black boys. So we're going to talk about what happened, but what we're not going to do is treat you as the problem that needs to be fixed or remediated or corrected. And then I reminded him of that conversation that we had like 3 years older when he was in kindergarten. He said, oh yeah, I remember that. So
Wow.
maybe that seems too radical for a lot of folks, Tawana, but I'm saying
it doesn't. It doesn't. And I think we need to stop. I think we need to spend some time with that because
Okay.
I think that's what people need to hear. That's powerful. Understanding the systems that our young people are in. And you said this whole idea over, triumph over trauma, focusing on how great our children are and reminding them that it's not that we're not going to look at what happened, but we're not going to spend our time staying stuck in that. I think that's huge. And so you said a lot right there, and the chat is blowing up from that already. I think that is really, really powerful, reminding people that, our children are going to make mistakes, but we cannot define them by the mistakes that they make. We have to remember to, teach this whole concept around discipline and how do we help them heal from, making a mistake or the experiences that they're in. I think that is great information. And I didn't want to cut you off, but I thought that was a powerful place for us to kind of stop and regroup, because when we listen to the video, when I listen to Dr. V, that's what the girls are saying. I am not this behavior. Stop and ask me what's wrong. Stop and ask me what I'm going through. And I think that's huge. I'm so excited that we had the opportunity. I think we need to have an expanded conversation. I don't know that we can cover all of this in an hour. I think we need an expanded conversation to really talk more about the why behind the behavior, but also I want people to have some concrete things that they can take away. And, Dr. V gave us her 3. I'm going to ask you to give us your 3. I think you gave us one powerful one already, but I'm going to ask you for a few more when we're looking at really creating spaces of healing for our young people. Can you give us 3 more suggestions that schools, families can use?
Yeah, so I guess if my first one would be that the notion of like honesty. I think then another I think would be courage. I think it's not easy. I think that many people talk about wanting to do this work and really wanting to engage kids in authentic ways. But it takes courage, because to look at a child is to look at yourself. And I think that's why I think at just a very basic fundamental level, that's why kids and babies are so cute, is because we see them and we see their innocence and we see their early formation. And it reminds us of a contaminated us. It reminds us of a more honest and sincere, original, sort of form. So to do that work with kids, with girls, requires you to really take that same sort of look inside. And I think that's what I would say is that, like, the courage to do that, I think sort of trumps in many ways. What you say to yourself is way more important than what you'll say to anybody else. And I think to talk to yourself, to understand, to listen to who you are, is not something that the average person is really invested in. So I would say courage would be the second. And then the third, I'll steal from Dr. V. I think the notion of community is just so necessary. Like, anybody who's trying to do this work by themselves, or anytime I meet someone and they're like, oh, it's all about their work or their model or their influence or their contributions, I sort of start to get a little suspicious, because I don't think, for individuals who are part of families and families who are part of communities, I don't think we can do this work as in like, here's my contribution. I think we have to lock arms. We have to do this together. And so the third would be maybe community. So there would be, the notion of honesty and courage and community in these approaches.
Awesome. Great. All right. I want to just pause for a minute as we're going to be closing out soon. And I know we had a question from the chat. I want to go back to it because I don't want to miss it. And it was up here, but I want to also encourage anyone else that has any additional questions to please put your questions in the chat at this time, so that we can take a minute to answer those. Okay. And there was a question around how can we help our children understand who they are with white supremacist attacks on historically accurate curricula? And I'll ask both of you to weigh in on that.
I think Dr. V's got that one nailed. Go ahead.
It's only hilarious because this is how I spend my daytime. And I know some of my team is here who also is fighting back against the CRT bans and the stand for culturally responsive education. But I think it goes back to Brian's, point. everybody at Gwen's Girls know that I identify as Pan-African. So, and I'm a part of the Pan-African community unapologetically, unabashedly, especially as someone who was raised as a part of the African community, in particular the Rastafarian tradition. And with that said, this fight is not new. It's not new. I think what is new is that now many of our children, more than any other time in history, is not being educated by people of African ancestry. That's just period. And actually, this is the first time in history too that more of our children are forced out of the home, sometimes as early as 6 weeks, years of age, or definitely by the age of 6 in most states, that they have to enter into formal schooling. And again, our ancestors predicted this. That's why they said we're going to need more Black lawyers, because they predicted, you know, these fights with the legal system here now is, you know, not just extrajudicial killings and vigilante, but also is being justified and policy. It's policy. White supremacy is policy. And two, our kids can go their entire careers without having a highly qualified Black teacher. That's why these community programs, after school programs, before school programs, Saturday school programs, summer programs are very important. And I think we have to let our children know, we have to be honest, because people are going to look at people like Brian and I like they just too radical, they too revolutionary. Let me tell you something, as somebody who works with the real doctors, the MDs, I ain't talking about the PhDs, okay? They know this. There are other people besides Africans who have survived this, including our Native Americans, indigenous brothers and sisters, including Jewish people. They know this. You cannot deal with healing without uplifting the culture. So that's the dilemma for Black people in America. Our kids are literally being taught and schooled by people who don't always look like them, speak like them, or even worship like them. That's our dilemma. So honesty is the best policy. Honesty, in this case, truth telling should be our practice. Look, daughter, you're gonna go up against some things. Guess what? You're gonna have whole people, whole adults with real education in front of the legislature, in front of the president, ready to burn down the country, so that you cannot get the education that you need, not only to compete within this capitalist market, but also what you need to survive as a human being in a white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy society. And this is not to minimalize, because I know something Black people do, y'all. Okay, like I'm like Brian, I got a daughter and a son. Okay, so let me tell you, I see it both ends. This is what our people like to do. We don't want to talk trauma, and we want to skip to the healing because we don't want to tell the truth about what's really going on with Black girls. Mm-hmm. And I know we don't want to air our dirty laundry. We've been taught so well not to air our dirty laundry. So what do? We are going to project. We're going to talk to everybody but ourselves about what's harming, the why behind the behavior of Black girls. When are we going to talk about molestation? When are we going to talk about rape? When are we going to talk about domestic violence in the home? When are we going to talk about addiction? Yes, white supremacy has a lot to do with it, but also how do we solve the problems within our community? Because you know what that is? That's revolutionary. We better stop waiting, y'all. We better stop waiting, because they was ready to burn the country down before they let us even have a vote. And that's what they're fighting. They don't want us to vote because our kids acted a fool after they killed us. So now they're trying to figure out how to suppress our kids better so they won't stand the line. Because we ain't never ran up. You want to know trauma? We've never ran up into anybody's Capitol building. Never.
Dr. V, the chat's blowing up.
We really need to be honest, because as long as we divert the attention, our Black girls will still be harmed, not only publicly, but also in the private sphere. And that's my concern.
Right. Okay. So you both touched on something. You touched on the whole concept of honesty. Brian talked about looking within. We have to look at ourselves and have a strong concept of ourselves. And then Dr. V, you talked about addressing what's going on in my, what goes on in my home stays in my home. So addressing those issues first so that we can really understand and help our young people here. And we have an ancestry responsibility, is what someone is saying in the chat. Truth teller, and we better stop waiting. They're reiterating what you're saying. So I think those things are great. I want to open it back up to see if there are any questions from people in the chat. You know, or there any questions that people have. And then while I'm waiting for questions, Dr. V, I want to talk about your latest book, Investing in the Educational Success of Black Girls. And it covers the topic of emotional literacy. How do you define this concept and why is it important for Black girls to have it? Or there's some models that work better than others? I think that's really important. How do we help our girls be successful in school? And then you talked about this whole thing with emotional literacy. So I'm anxious to hear about this.
Yeah, so the emotional literacy, that's actually Dr. Charlotte Jacobs, Dr. Charlotte Jacobs. So our book, which the virtual book launch is tomorrow, I believe. Hopefully someone from the Planet Venus team can give out that information. Thank you, Janice. And so investing in the educational success of Black women and girls, there's a chapter written by Dr. Charlotte Jacobs out of Penn State University. So right in y'all neck of the woods, I have to connect her to you all actually. And she writes about emotional literacy based off her experiences as a Black girl, now a Black woman, but also as a Black teacher. And so also what she did was she took my work on resilience, Black girls, and looking at our experiences in our family, our community, communities in our schools, and this idea of critical pedagogy or critical race pedagogy. And like Brian's framework on, you know, centering Pan-Africanism and also these conversations around racism in our how we teach. And so this idea of emotional literacy in the same ways that we teach biology, in the ways that we teach kids geometry, the ways that we teach them history. What if we taught them about emotions and how we process our emotions? So the candid conversations that Brian and the kid's mom is having around, you know, okay, you know, you might experience harm. You have a right to be angry and frustrated. People are going to get angry and frustrated with you. And so what does this feel like? What does it look like? And how can we teach teachers to tolerate our kids' full humanity? I saw someone in the chat, I think it was Fahari, had mentioned about humanity. We need to treat our children as if they're full human beings. Guess what? Full human beings have the privilege, have the right to experience a spectrum of emotions, including anger, including happiness, including just being solemn. But our Black girls are being punished for everything. If they laugh too loud, if they get angry, or if they're withdrawn in class, right? So emotional literacy is also teaching our children. I could have used this. Twanda. Y'all would not have had to get me out of jail a couple months ago. I could have used this. I could have avoided so many suspensions. Sandra, I'm serious though. Sandra's laughing, but I'm serious. I could have avoided so many suspensions, so many reprimands in class. I could have possibly avoided even negative encounters with the police state. If I understood how to read my emotions. Now, all of us know, if you understand Black girls and Black girls' emotionality, we have never been a threat to this country. We've never tried to shoot up a school. We have not. So we have never been a threat to the establishment. So the way that once we learn how to read our emotions, we'll learn how to control all of that joy, all of that rage, all of that frustration for good, whether it's to navigate that school environment, whether it's to protect another girl, or if it's to change policies in our states as well as across the nation. So emotional literacy, it's beyond SEL, social emotional literacy. That's putting too much responsibility on the teachers, giving them too much responsibilities. As I've always said, the average teacher in the United States is somewhere between the age of 25 and 35, right? And also they're more than likely white and coming from a suburban or middle-class background, where research also shows that white women have the lowest self-esteem than any other group in the country. Research shows that Black girls have the highest self-esteem than any other group in the country. And we also have the highest leadership capacity than any other groups of girls. That's a cocktail for disaster. So not too many white women is going to teach a Black girl about healthy emotions. But what we all can do to be more compassionate, again, the why behind the behavior. And I dropped the book in the chat. If you all can read it, it's a psychiatrist that Oprah loves. Yes, he's white, but it's a good book. It's asked, the name of the book is, it's not the why, but I dropped it in the chat. It's Bruce Perry.
Bruce Perry, Dr. Perry.
Yeah, yeah, Dr. Bruce Perry. And it's a good book. Maybe Ms. Baines can drop it in for us. But nonetheless, that book, it asks us the question, the why, the why, the why. And so it's not asking Black children to sit in their trauma. That's where we went wrong with trauma informed. We don't want people to sit in their trauma. We want them to analyze their body, understand the emotions that is attached to that thought, and not necessarily control it, acknowledge it, and accept who you are. And we can teach white teachers how to be in their body and sit in their body. That's why I call myself a somatic abolitionist. But then we also can teach our children, our girls, our young women, how to acknowledge their emotions and not try to become something that's not going to help them thrive spiritually, culturally, and mentally in the long run. You have to process those emotions. So that's emotional literacy. We can teach that. It's being taught at Gwen's Girls. And all of us can learn, the adults and children alike. America is a violent culture. Historically speaking, America is a violent culture. Adults attempted an insurrection, not the youth.
Thank you, Dr. V, for sharing that. We can teach our girls emotional literacy. I think that's huge. I want to go back over to Brian, and I want to ask you a little bit about your work in the schools. What have been some of the successes that you have, but also what may be some of the barriers that you've experienced as well with the work that you're doing in the school?
Barriers, Dr. B just spoke to. I think the average classroom, the average school district is not intended for emotional health and wellness for Black people. That's a very obvious obstacle. It's always an uphill battle. If you're trying to get people to feel good in a classroom scenario, it's tough to do. I'm not sure it can be done. So that's the obstacle, or one of the obstacles.
And somebody even put in the chat that it should be a mandatory training for every educator that's teaching Black youth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like when we look at right now, state standards that require mental health as part of teacher training curriculum only exist in about 21% of the state standards. That means that the average teacher gets certified and credentialed to teach, to spend 8 hours a day, 5 times a week, almost all year long, without any preparation as it relates to mental health whatsoever. That's the current status quo. So again, when you even comprehend what we're finding, in our preliminary data, the average teacher knows that there are problems, mental health challenges with their students, but many teachers feel literally afraid and hesitant to even try to go there because they haven't been prepared. They feel anywhere from awkward to literally like scared to death to even try to broach these types of conversations. If it's not curricular, then the average teacher feels like, that's not me. And to Dr. B's point, in some cases, it's not. So anyway, our model is not about making teachers into mental health professionals. It's simply about engaging or encouraging a climate where the mental health is just as important as the physical health. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we start with, if a student walked in and she had tripped and fall and like dislocated her ankle, you wouldn't be like, turn to chapter 4. You'd be like, oh, we got to fix your ankle.
Right.
I can't expect you to look you in on chapter 4 and you got a bloody ankle. Well, why don't we do that same thing with mental and emotional, dynamics? So again, the teacher is not necessarily the healer, but the teacher has to be able to identify and navigate what's going on in the mental health space. So that conversation, I think, is where some of the successes are. Simply having these conversations actualizes teachers to be able to say, like, now I feel now I feel more confident. Like, I don't necessarily know how to fix this human, but I know what to do to move them in the right direction. I see it as my responsibility as a teacher. And so I think we have a lot of different versions of that story as success, but every single one counts, Tawanda. This isn't about like mass numbers. This is about, affecting people's lives and, one life or two life or whatever, so that's how I would sort of frame success.
And
Oh, I
teachers they can re-trigger the students, and that's what's happening across many of our school sites. Teachers, the adults in the schools are re-triggering, they're re-traumatizing the students, so they're firing off of each other, their neurons literally. And also, right, to piggy off Brian's point, now our teachers have to do the work too. We also need to work with the adults in the school sites. America is a violent culture, so we need opportunities to help heal our educators and adults, and everybody from that school resource officer to the principal in the building. That's just the reality. We can't assume because they're white and degreed and female that they can't do no harm or haven't been harmed. If we look at the stats, over 80% of Americans have experienced some type of trauma, childhood trauma. So we're actually asking people in traumatized bodies to work with young people in traumatized bodies. And we know these same people may have low self-esteem. Yeah, so the teachers have to do the work too, the adults.
They have to be willing to do it. Absolutely. We have gotten a lot of calls even at Gwen's Girls to support the education environment. And it's amazing because when community-based organizations go in, we do see a difference. And it's almost that our girls are welcoming and they're happy. It's almost like a sigh of relief when they see many of us come into the school system. And, Dr. V, you talk a lot about joy. I'm going to ask you, why is joy so important in your work with Black women and girls to the collective healing? I think one of the things that happens when we enter into the school systems, we do bring that energy into the schools. We're happy to see them. When they come into Gwen's Girls, it's always, hey, we're happy you're here.
Yes. Cultivating joy and loving kindness. And so actually Dr. Monique Morris and Janice Diaz, they talk a lot about Black girls' joy. And I remember when it was actually a brother scholar, when he said, hey, let's talk about Black boy joy. I thought, what in the world? And it's at a time when Black girls were, being policed for being too happy, dancing in class or laughing out loud or talking too loud. They were policing childhood. But you're right, Black women and girls, we've always brought emotionality into the learning experience. And that's because most of us at home, we were raised to help with the older children, to help the younger children, to help the women, and also to serve the elderly. And we're supposed to do it with a sense of humility. And so joy has always been a part of our girlhood games. And so we didn't, even if we were living in toxic communities or families, you can look at comedians, Black comedians. I study Black comedy. I love Black comedians. If y'all want to know where I get this sharp tongue from, it's Dick Gregory. Right? And because historically, Black people, we've used humor and satire to not only deconstruct our environments, but to push back. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran. Like love is an action word, right? And so that's where we started, a love proxy. If you can imagine, there were Black women whose children were stolen and sold away from them during enslavement. And what they would do, they would go and help raise another person's child. We carry that over through our Southern traditions in the South. I still see it when I go to West Africa. You're jumping in, and you find in that love, you find joy. We create spaces of joy. So from a research perspective, the question becomes, how can adults or older girls help to facilitate joy, laughter, humor, which is to be human, right? That was a Freudian slip, within our cultural spaces. So how do we facilitate joy and not just focus on the pain, the harm, and the suffering, because that's where we create a love praxis. How do we practice a love praxis?
I love praxis. I love that. One of my favorite sayings that I actually heard from another woman is that there's no correction without connection. There's power in relationship building, and joy and love is one way that we build that connection to our girls and to our young people. There's some questions in the chat that I want to make sure that we answer. So, what role can community members and parents play in infatuating the changes y'all have discussed? That's one of the questions. I'll start there and I'll ask you both to respond to that, because I think people want to be able to walk away, and you did give us some concrete strategies, but for a lot of educators that may be on the line and other practitioners, parents that are even on this line, they want to know, how can I get started, and what are some concrete things that I can do immediately? And why don't you start off, Brian? You want to start off with that?
Yeah, two quick answers. One, I think organizations like Gwen's Girls, Gwen's Girls gets a lot of credit. They don't get enough credit because the energy and the ability to not only advocate but find out what's happening. That's invaluable information that school systems need in order to be able to actualize what Dr. V is talking about. So again, partnerships is just an early sort of version of the notion of like it having to be an integrated collaborative. Can't happen it can't happen in schools, but not happen outside of the schools. Like it's got to just happen. And I feel like Gwen's Girls and organizations like this one are leading that charge. The other is just reconceptualizing like the labels. Like we have categories and schemas and boxes for like teacher and parent. But the reality is teachers do a lot of parenting and parents do a lot of teaching. So in our work, it's a lot about like understanding that, again, this is not like your job, her job, my job, this job. It's a person that has to be, you see what I'm saying? Like cared for. It's a person, it's a life that has to be nurtured. And so without the labels and the categories, I think parents feel more responsible and actualized to actually do things for kids in schools. And teachers, conversely, feel the same way about doing things for kids outside of the classroom. And all of that translates to the kid, because the data clearly shows that when a child or a young student sees a teacher as that's their only role, things don't tend to work out. It's over and over again, we've heard the narratives around young students, whether it's student athletes who talk about coaches or students that talk about teachers. They consistently refer back to the notion of what the teacher did over and above what their job was. And so I feel like working towards a model or working towards a day in which we as adult community see like our collective responsibility and don't sort of pigeonhole it into, well, I'm the janitor, or I'm the bus driver, or I'm the teacher, or that's a parent. If we can get there or anywhere close to it, I think we'll be better off than where we are today.
That's huge. So understanding that we all play a part in this and the connection that we have with our young people. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. V?
Brian, good point. Every time I go into these schools, man, you and I got to hook up after the call because you got me fired up. But every time I go into these schools and universities, this has to start with the bus drivers and the people answering the phones. It can't just be just one teacher or one after school program. It's an entire village community. And that is one approach that I did learn from working in both South Africa and Ghana. We piecemeal it here in the States, I also put in the chat for the parent or the person who asked the question, one, give our girls opportunities to learn via play. They're girls.
Even our teenage girls, absolutely.
Yes, let them play. I don't care if we used to do a lot of patty cakes and stuff. I don't know what they do anymore. It's, fruit cocktail. Those of y'all who know those songs. Opportunities to learn via play. Because the research and youth resilience does show that actually kids are more stimulated when they're working with other children on something that challenges them, but it's fun. And again, that can be double dutch, that can be hopscotch, that can be basketball, it can be chess, even some of these video games that the parents are like, I don't know what they're doing, but that's important and it should be organized. Also, in my book, Teaching Black Girls, Muse, based off the research, Muse relationships with healthy adults. Did you hear me, Twanda?
Youth relationships with healthy adults.
Yes. So a muse is different from a mentor. And I have a lot of science published articles on this, so I'm not going to go into the details of what a mentor versus muse. We have mentor programs. We have the most highly funded ones in the country. They don't necessarily work long-term according to the data. But a muse relationship is when you get someone like Tashara, and she's telling our girls day in, day out, Miss Denise, Twanda, right? I seen some of our other Gwen's Girl staff. I think I saw Amy. When you tell a girl what you've been through, and you've shared it, the hardships as well as the good stuff, but you also tell them how you overcame it, that's a muse relationships. It's not a mentor relationships that's based off men relationships. Like, I got here by doing this. No, it's a little different. We're at lunch. I'm telling you, girl, if you only knew the mistakes I made, or child, if you only knew that one time, but I learned from it and this is how I got over it. So it's mutually sharing a reciprocal relationship. Thirdly, adults, I'm gonna tell you this as a parent, heal thyself. Our students, that too. Our children, they are our reflection. Would y'all tell them? I have a young man, adult child, and I'm telling you, for some reason, the boys go after your moral characters. The girls just go after your self-esteem. Like, Mom, were you really gonna wear that today? Right? I was, but I guess I won't now. Whereas I have a son who he questions my morality. Wait, I know that you fight for people's rights, but did you make wasn't that a classist statement that you just said? So your children are a reflection, but all children pick up on this. They're just more open, to stimuli, than other people. We've been, rinsed and dried for the most part. So adults, do the work. And one thing I learned as a parent, that when I did the work, I actually related to my children better and more authentically. I am a mother, I am a woman, I am African, I am Black, I am a worker, I am a teacher, I am a student, right? So I was just more authentic when I did the work on myself, and I fought against my own, negative behaviors or addictions, right? And so our children watch that, and kids want to be around you when you become more whole. So do the work, and you'll naturally not do harm. Let's put it that way. Finally, number 4, redistribute funds to Black women-led youth organizations that are doing the work. Period.
Dr. V, you guys said a lot. There's just one thing I'm gonna ask for those parents, for those even educators that are like, I feel like I've tried everything. I just don't know what else to do. For that parent that's saying, I'm throwing up my hands, can't do this anymore. What would you say to them? Because I know we have some people on the line that may be struggling right now and they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. What do we say to them in terms of how they get through it?
This has been the hard part for me, because I have always had my feet in 3 different areas, right? So the research scholar stuff, the activism work, and then the clinical. So I get the best of both worlds, or all worlds, I should say. And parents, I hear y'all. I used to be all about theory, but now I'm all about practicality. And I think, Twanda, you've pushed me on this a bit too in our work together, and other Gwen's Girl staff. Y'all, we do have some children who they've seen and been through so much, sometimes even before they were born. That's transgenerational. They're hard to love. And it's a whole clinical. I work with youth in care who've experienced the horrors of the child foster care system. They're adults now, so I work with them now after the fact. And I could tell you it's hard, and parents, they want to give up, And some can't give up and some won't give up. Others will give up because they feel like they had no other options. And that's why that Bruce Perry book is very, very important. It's the most important pieces I've ever read as someone who, again, the psychiatrist. I work with one of the largest university medical schools, working with their students. So that's how much people do trust the work that I'm trying to do. So with that said, know when to seek out therapy. I love, and Gwen Girls does this, I appreciate a wraparound approach. So you may have a caseworker, you have your therapist, you still have your mentor, you have parents or foster parents involved. But therapy is okay. And we need more clinicians of color. We're not going to solve that problem anytime soon. That's why the medical students said, no, we want her. And we just have a shortage. It's if you think it's hard to get into teaching and education, it's damn sure hard to become this, do the clinical side, because of a history of educational disenfranchisement. So Twanda, knowing when to ask for help, and it's okay. We're destigmatizing mental illness. And also therapy works. Sometimes it doesn't even matter the race and the ethnicity of the therapist. Because research shows as long as you have someone to talk to, you're going to get some help. Now, if you can find someone who's gender and culturally responsive, that would be even better. But no, it's okay to ask for therapeutic help, destigmatize mental illness.
So you've got to take care of the caregiver, is what I'm hearing you say, Dr. V. And I think sometimes, as parents, we don't know when to say, hey, look, I better take care of me, because I'm not going to be able to do this if I don't. Thank you so much for that. Brian, I'm going to throw it out to you. What do we say to that parent that has said, okay, I've had enough, or even to the educators, the people in the school? What do we say to them? Thank you for saying that.
Hit me up. That's what I say. And I mean that literally and figuratively. Like, I'm a resource. I've always got time on my calendar for those types of conversations, because like Dr. V said, I'm a parent and I've been there. And sometimes you just don't have it all. None of us as individuals have it all. Community. So I mean that literally. Feel free to reach out to me, but also figuratively, like if you don't actually reach out to me, reach out to someone. Like, don't feel like you got to do it all. Like, there's someone out there. I know I've met enough black folks in my life to know we all got somebody. So I would say if you feel like you're at the end of the road, be honest about that and reach out to someone who can get you to the next phase on your journey.
And I included Therapy for Black Girls, www.therapiesforblackgirls. That's a therapy for Black women clinicians that are considered highly qualified. And also, y'all, let's keep in mind while we're having these real conversations that our children are dying at higher rates of suicide than we've ever seen in history. Also, our girls are reporting more rates of suicidal ideation and self-harm. I mean, they're thinking about suicide or hurting themselves, ways to hurt themselves. And so don't question I know I come from a generation, be like, ain't nothing wrong with that girl, she just crazy. Girl, go to sleep, get some rest. You just need rest. So stop acting like them white people. Now you're talking crazy because you're going to school with white folks. It's real. And they're completing suicide. So if you feel like your child is starting to threaten suicide, self-harm to herself or to others, get the help. And also, this is another thing, y'all stop thinking, because if our kids are calling themselves gay or they identify with the LGBTQI community, take it serious. I don't think praying it away is going to help, and if they certainly may not think that, so also just, provide them with a safe space to, discuss openly their sexuality or sexual identities or any questions that they have related to sexuality and sexual identity. Because I'm seeing a lot of that pop up too in my practice, and it's threatening the lives of our young people.
Thank you. This has been powerful. To echo one of the comments in the chat, this has been absolutely amazing, eye-opening in so many ways. Thank you both for being here and for the insight, wisdom. You have been greatly appreciated. I want to do this again. I think that we could take an even deeper dive into this. This has been so helpful to me. I'm glad my children are adults now, but this would have been great information for me to have as I was raising my two daughters. As we get ready to close out, I want to go to a video as we close out and just say this was powerful. I got a lot from this, and I'm sure that the people that were fortunate enough to be on today got a lot from your wisdom and your expertise and you know, everything that you've offered today. Some of the books I haven't read, I can't wait to go and to get them and to read them. So thank you for the insight and the knowledge. Your contact information is there. Your website information is there. Your social media information is there. So we definitely want to be able to access you if we need to. And if there are no other comments, let's roll the footage for the last video and we will close out. And I see people are saying, thanks for the space, for being here. This was helpful to a lot of people. I see some of our parents are in. And are we able to roll the video?
Yep, I'm pulling it up now, Miss.
Okay, great. And we'll close out with this.
So what do you think the why is behind the behavior?
I think a lot of adolescent misbehavior comes from pain. And then if you're dealing with adults who are coming at you more harsh, that's going to make you shut down more. And that's going to lead to a chain, just more and more bad behavior instead of what's wrong or what made you feel this way, instead of being attacked. You know, you get in defense mode when you're being attacked. So just, you know, parents, teachers, just people of higher positions than us, just to take those things into consideration, that maybe I'm going through something or maybe I'm hurt.
All right. So let's remember to look at the why behind the behavior. Thank you again, Dr. V and Brian, for being here in this space with us. And we'll see you the next time.